be a mom again?" he asked, smiling. "I can actually enjoy motherhood this time," she replied, rubbing her daughter's back. "You weren't able to before?" he asked. Bastila sighed as she swayed back and forth a little. "I was traveling on missions and trying to find you, Anakin. I didn't really get the chance of being the doting mother," she replied. Anakin nodded his head slowly. "Bastila, what was this Revan like?" he asked. She stared at him for a second. "As great of a fighter Revan was, he was worse than me when it came to missions. All I can compare him to is, he's just as cold as the other Jedi in this century are, maybe even worse," she replied. "Yet you were with him?" he asked. "I was a foolish woman then," she replied with a sigh. "I thought he cared about me as much as I had him." The younger man was silent, and Bastila sat down across from him while her daughter slept in the crook of her arm. "I did however learn what true commitment was before I met Obi-Wan, and that was Starkiller. He taught me what a relationship is truly about," she added. "And you still insist that he was me?" he asked. "You and Anakin Starkiller are two completely different people. Do I believe that you are a reincarnated form of him? Yes, but are you him?" "No," she replied. Anakin nodded his head slowly in understanding. "Revan was a Sith, right?" he asked. "Yes, he was once," she replied, "and so was I, don't forget that." "Well, how long were you a Sith Lord?" he asked. Bastila sighed as she moved Sasha so she was lying in front of her on her lap, holding her tiny hands in hers. "Long enough," she replied. "Is it possible that any Sith Lord could be redeemed?" "Do you always have to kill a Sith Lord?" he asked. "What do you mean?" she asked. "I mean, what if someone was raised as a Sith, could they be redeemed into a better life that they never experienced?" he asked. The former Jedi sat back as she looked at her child, as her mind drifted back a little to another time, her memories playing like a holovid. 17-year-old Bastila gasped as she rolled out of the way, a red lightsaber almost connected to her shoulder. "Anakin, please," she called out as she jumped to her feet. "Stop calling me that," he answered, his yellow eyes glaring at her. Bastila held her lightsaber up, blocking an attack to her head. "Anakin. Listen to me, you're nothing like your brother, you're not as evil as you portray yourself as," she insisted. "You don't know me," he snarled at her. "I do know you. You keep telling me you are Mathesa revanchist, but how true is that? You have done too much good to be evil," she insisted. He let out a shout as he aimed his lightsaber toward her middle, making her jump back. "You once told me you want to be better than him. You want to get out from his shadow. Join us, Anakin, join our side and you can do so much good," she told him. "Stop it with your evil Jedi lies," he snapped. "You have to listen to me, Anakin, because I can't bear to kill you," she answered. Holding up her hand, she threw him back onto the ground. "I can't kill you and I won't," she told him. Before he could answer, she placed her hands on his face and pressed her lips to his. Letting him go, she took her lightsaber and tossed it to the ground. "Kill me if you want, but I cannot and will not kill you," she added. She watched as his eyes slowly turned from yellow to blue. "Will you join me, Anakin Starkiller?" she asked, holding her hand out to him. He stared at her hand for a second before he reached up and grasped it, making her smile. Bastila opened her eyes, looking over at her former apprentice. "It could be possible," she told him finally. "Really?" he asked, watching his eyes light up with hope. "Yes, sometimes if you just say or do the right thing, it could redeem the person," she replied. "Why?" Anakin shrugged. "I'm just wondering," he told her. Bastila raised her eyebrow at him, but she knew that he was too stubborn to divulge any information he wasn't willing to reveal. Even though it did concern her as well with the look in his eye. "I should get going, Padme will begin to wonder where I am," he commented as he stood up. Bastila stood up, placing the sleeping baby into her bassinet. "Anakin," she called to him. Anakin stopped and looked at her as she stood in front of him. "Don't keep secrets from me," she told him, touching his cheek as a mother would her child. He nodded his head slowly. "No secrets, I promise," he answered before leaving the hovel. Bastila watched as he climbed his speeder bike, racing back towards his home, and left her standing there feeling uneasy. At night, the three neighboring homesteads were sleeping peacefully. Anakin and Padme were lying in their bed fast asleep with their arms around each other, while their children in the room next to them were fast asleep with their blankets up to their chins. In the Kenobi house, while Obi-Wan was fast asleep, Bastila was tossing and turning in her sleep. Sweat was beading on her forehead as she was struggling with her dreams. Bastila was sitting beside a lava pit with a burnt, beaten body in her arms. Mom is here," she said softly, stroking the person's burnt cheek. "H hurts," the person groaned, gripping her wrist. "I know, I'm here," she insisted softly. The person was struggling to breathe, holding on to her. The dream skipped to her cradling the now limp body in her arms. "No. No," she screamed. Bastila shot up from the bed, gasping for air. "No," she cried out before she could stop herself. "Bastila, what's the matter?" Obi-Wan asked, sitting up, resting his hands on her shoulders. She looked over her shoulder at her husband, letting out a sigh. Nothing, it's nothing, I'm alright, she assured him, giving him her best smile. Are you sure? He asked. Yes, I'm alright, she replied. Obi-Wan stroked her wavy hair with a concerned look in his eye. Obi-Wan, I promise, I'm alright, she assured him softly. Seeing that she wouldn't tell him what she had dreamt about, he pressed a kiss to her cheek. I love you, he told her softly. Reaching up, she rested her hand over his with a small smile. I love you, she answered. She watched as he lied back down, and sleep claimed him again. Sighing, she climbed out of bed and went over to the nursery that was across the hall. Walking over to her sleeping daughter's crib, she looked over the side to see her fast asleep with her tiny arms resting up by her head. Smiling, Bastila reached down and stroked her daughter's cheek gently. I'll tell Dad you said hi, a voice filled her head, making her shake her head slowly with a sigh. Looking down at her daughter, she watched as Sasha's tiny hand curled around her index finger. Your uncle Anakin is lying to me, that simply won't do, she murmured softly. The next day at the Skywalker homestead, Anakin was in the garage fixing a speeder a neighbor dropped off for repair when he felt a presence behind him. What are you hiding, Anakin Skywalker? Bastila demanded, her arms crossed over her chest. Anakin looked over his shoulder at her. What do you mean? He asked. Don't play the dumb game with me, Anakin. I have been around for centuries, don't play me for a fool, she scolded. Sighing, he stood up from the ground. What is going on? She asked. Anakin leaned against the speeder, swinging his tool around in his hands. I found something out, Bastila, something that just changes everything of what I saw about my mission as the Chosen One, as you keep calling me, he replied. What is that? She asked. Anakin closed his eyes, lowering his head a little. What's the matter? She asked. Bastila, Demonia is my sister, he replied with a frustrated sigh as he tossed the tool across the garage. Bastila sighed sadly, watching as her former apprentice was pacing back and forth. I'm supposed to destroy the Sith, how can I destroy them when one of them is one I was created by the Force with? The Force created her too, Bastila, wouldn't that mean the Force chose her as well? He asked. The prophecy spoke of only one chosen one, Anakin, she replied, this could be your greatest test of all right here. Knowing your sister is part of the Sith is your test given to you by the will of the Force. Well, I already failed the test because I'm not killing my own sister, he told her as he left the garage. Bastila shook her head slowly. The test could also try to get you to mask your feelings, because if the Emperor even catches a quick whiff of your connection to Demonia could mean your death as well as hers, she explained, going after him. What? Are you saying Sidious would kill my sister just to try to bring me to his side? He asked. He'll do whatever he pleases to try to get you to join him. He desires to have the greatest power in the universe on his side, Bastila explained. What do you want me to do? Anakin asked as he looked at her. Bastila stood in front of him. Shield your feelings, don't bury them like the other Jedi would tell you, but mask them. There is no crime for loving your sister, but it could be used against you, she replied. And what about killing her? He asked. I won't do it, Bastila. The Force will guide you, young one, she answered, resting her hand on his shoulder. Nodding his head slowly, he put his head in his hands, letting out a shaky breath. My sister's a Sith, he muttered. Knowing exactly how he felt, she reached up and pulled him into a comforting embrace as a mother would comfort her child. Anakin let out a shaky breath with tears in his eyes as he hugged her back. It's not just the fact she's a Sith, Bastila, it's what it would do to Mom if she ever found out. Oh, Force Mom. He exclaimed, letting her go. Don't tell her, Bastila answered. How can I keep this a secret from her? For 25 years she's always wondered what happened to my sister, he pointed out. Do you think it would do her good if she knew her daughter was turned into the very evil you are trying to kill? Bastila asked. Anakin was silent for a minute, but then he nodded his head slowly. Agreed, we don't tell, he murmured. Bastila nodded before they went back to his hovel. Bastila smiled as she was preparing lunch for Sasha. Her 1-year-old toddled in with her favorite stuffed toy in her arm. Mommy, Hunji, she told her mother. It'll be ready soon, sweetheart, Bastila replied. Sasha stuck her thumb in her mouth as she sat on the floor to play with the blocks Anakin made for her as a life day gift. Obi-Wan was in town, helping Anakin with his shop. Bastila looked at her daughter with a small smile as she crouched down in front of her, making the block float up. Sasha's eyes widened and she smiled around her thumb. One day you learn to do this too, she told her daughter softly. Sasha giggled, pulling her thumb from her mouth again when they heard the door chime go off. Stay right here and keep playing with your toys, she told her daughter. Sasha nodded and kept playing with her toys. Walking up the steps, Bastila opened the door and stopped in her tracks at who was on the other side. A tall man with shoulder-length black hair, dark brown eyes, wearing black boots, black pants, a black tunic, and a black cloak around his shoulders. Revan, she trailed off, her eyes wide in disbelief. Bastila, he started. Before another word could leave his mouth, a resounding crack could be heard, and his head jerked to the side while Bastila's hand was still raised. You lowlife Sith scum. She hissed as she shoved him back. You made me think you were dead all these years. Bastila, listen to me, he insisted. No. Get out. She snapped as she hit the button on the hovel door, the door slamming in his face. As she was storming back down the stairs, she could hear the door open. Get out, Revan. She hissed. Bastila, you must understand my reason for leaving, he insisted. And what reason would that be, Revan? She demanded, turning around to look at him. Before he could answer, he saw a young child standing at the end of the stairs with wide brown eyes. Mama, she whimpered, holding her arms up to Bastila. Walking over, Bastila lifted her daughter up into her arms and kissed her forehead tenderly. I felt through the Force that there had been changes with you, he commented. What? Did you think that when you came back 3,900 years that I'd still be waiting for you? She asked as she cradled her daughter close. Revan was silent, clearing his throat. Sasha whimpered, curling up further into her mother's protective arms. She's a beautiful child, Revan commented. Thank you, Bastila replied as she set Sasha down in her high chair to feed her. Sasha was kicking her feet, her brown eyes watching Revan as he stood in the kitchen. Nikaka aswanga, she told her daughter softly. Eat this, little one. The little girl nodded before eating the food on her little plate. Bastila stroked her daughter's auburn hair before looking at her former lover. This is just different to see you act as a mother, he commented. Act? This is far from acting, Revan. I am a mother, she answered as she walked by him while keeping an eye on her daughter. I apologize, this is just so odd, he told her. Bastila rolled her eyes as she started gathering the toys that Sasha had scattered all over the floor. Well, if you hadn't abandoned me all those years ago, you would have seen me be a mother before, she answered. You knew I had a mission, he told her. Yes, well, you still abandoned me, pregnant and all, she answered. Revan stared at her in surprise. Pregnant? He asked. Yes, oh that's right, she never even knew about you so she never took your name, she replied as she put Sasha's toys into her toy box. Wait, what was her name? Revan asked. Letting out a sigh, the former Jedi looked over at the former Sith. Senator Leia Starkiller, she replied. She saw his eyes grow wide in shock, and she suddenly saw a flare of what she swore was jealousy. Senator Starkiller? He asked. Yes, does the name sound familiar? She demanded. Revan growled under his breath. Anakin, he said angrily. I'm surprised you remembered the name he took, she answered. How could I not? He demanded. Bastila watched as he started pacing the den, muttering under his breath. Are you saying he raised my daughter? He asked. She was never your daughter, DNA-wise, yes, but other than that, no, she was never yours, she replied. Starkiller raised her. He snapped. Because he adored her, Anakin loved that little girl as if she were his own flesh and blood. Force Revan, he delivered her. She exclaimed. That means nothing. He snapped. Bastila stared him. How could it mean nothing? He loved Leia, she answered. She pointed her finger at him. You didn't give a Sith spit about us, she added angrily. My mission, he started. The former Jedi covered her ears. I don't want to hear about your mission. This is practically the same fight Starkiller and I had when Leia was only a year old, she muttered. Letting out a deep breath, she looked over at her daughter. I adored my daughter just as much as he did, she added. What about your son? Revan asked, forcing her to look back at him. How? She started. Anakin Mathaser Shan. I'm no fool, he answered. He saw Bastila's eyes cloud over at the name. Or Matty Shan as his biography stated in his aliases, he added. Before he could react, Bastila's fist connected to his jaw, making him stumble back. Don't you ever talk about my son. Never. She snapped as she shoved him. You have no grounds to utter his name. Revan wiped the blood from his chin. I may have left you alone while you were pregnant, but I would have been there for you if I had known. I wouldn't have left you and the child alone willingly as you had with your daughter-in-law and grandchild. He snapped. Before he could react, Bastila had grabbed a hold of his arm and threw him to the ground. Calling out into the Force, her lightsaber flew into her hand. She ignited the blade and pointed it at his throat. You don't know anything that happened. She snapped angrily. She kept him pinned to the ground. I saw my grandson quite a few times during his life. Just because I wasn't there every single day never meant I was never there. I told Delilah where to meet with me so I could see Sai. You will never know true pain. Never will you have to endure the galaxy-shattering heartbreak when your child dies in your arms and there's nothing you can do to stop it. Never will you have to endure hearing their screams of pain echo through your head. She told him angrily. Revan stared up at her. I loved my children with all my heart and I would die for them. I still would for Anakin and Sasha. They are my children. I might not have given birth to Anakin, but he is like the son I had lost. She hissed. I find it even more interesting how really Maddie was my nephew since you moved on with my brother. He snapped. Bastila held her arm up ready to strike Revan when someone grabbed her around the waist. Bastila, stop. Stop, no, Obi-Wan told her, pulling her back. Let me kill him, Obi-Wan. She snapped, struggling against him. No, Bastila, don't sell your soul to the dark side after you have won your life back, Obi-Wan insisted. Bastila fell a little limp in her husband's arms as the words sunk in, and Revan stood up from the floor. Unsith Pudu. She hissed before spitting at his feet. You are Sith Pudu. Who are you? Obi-Wan asked. This is Revan, she answered for him. Obi-Wan stared at him surprise. I thought he started. I was wrong, he's just been a coward and hiding. Bastila snapped. Revan just fixed his vest. Well, does your newest lover know of your secrets that you keep from your apprentice? He asked. Husband, and it is none of your concern of what I do and don't tell him. Speaking of my apprentice, you stay away from Anakin. Bastila snapped. I could show him a few things of the Force that you haven't, he answered. And what is that? Saying family will only hold him back. The fact he is married and has children is foolish. She demanded. Revan just stared at her. This is coming from the woman who had no desire of such a commitment, he commented. Only because I was a foolish girl who thought was in love with you when it was your brother the whole time. She snapped, and your brother was right, you could never stand the idea of your brother having something you want. The former Sith stared at her in silence. Yes, you hated the idea that I loved him, you hated that he had won my affections first, she told him. Yet you carried my daughter, he answered. Don't call her that because she was never your daughter. Your brother raised her as his own. She was his daughter, not yours. She answered. Obi-Wan kept his arms around his wife's waist, listening to her rant at him. I should be thanking you, Revan. I really should, because if you hadn't given me the mission to find the Chosen One, I wouldn't have had to use my abilities to keep me young to find him. I wouldn't have found Anakin, he would have fallen to a horrible fate. I wouldn't have met and fell in love with the most incredible man in the galaxy. One you can never ever compare to. She ranted. The former Jedi general couldn't help but half smile at the last part of her speech, unconsciously hugging her close. Ah yes, a former Jedi general, I have heard the many stories of Obi-Wan Kenobi, he commented. He's a wonderful Jedi as well as a wonderful husband and father. Something you can never be, she answered. Revan cleared his throat, she could see that he was hiding his embarrassment. Don't go near Anakin, Revan. I won't allow you to undo all of my training. I won't let you try to turn him into a heartless man that would abandon his family, she added. I would have thought you'd teach him that, he answered. Before she could say anything, Obi-Wan pulled her behind him. That is quite enough, he told Revan, glaring at him, I won't have you disrespecting my wife. And how long were you chasing her, Kenobi? How long did you have to trail behind her until she actually saw you? Revan asked. He didn't chase me, if anything I chased him, Bastila replied with a small half grin. Letting out a sigh, she turned towards her daughter. If you excuse me, I'd like you to leave, and she started when she felt a shock of pain rush through her chest, forcing her to collapse to one knee on the floor. Seeing her collapse, Obi-Wan grabbed a hold of her. Bastila, what's wrong? He asked. Exactly what I was here to warn her about, Revan replied. Obi-Wan looked at him. What are you talking about? He demanded as Bastila grabbed a hold of his hand. The Sith alchemy spell she was using to keep herself young is starting to backfire. Her cells are degenerating, Revan explained. Are you saying she's dying? Obi-Wan asked. But I stopped using the spell. I stopped using it the day I married Obi-Wan, she replied. Our bodies weren't made to live over 3,000 years, Revan told her. Obi-Wan shook his head slowly as he suddenly pressed his hand over his wife's hand that was clasping at her chest. Revan watched as pale blue light formed around their hands. Bastila let out a small gasp as the pain began to fade away. Leaning forward, he pressed a kiss to her forehead as she lost consciousness from the pain. Lifting her up into his arms, he moved to the back of the hovel without even glancing at Revan. When he walked back out, Obi-Wan stared at the infamous Revan. I would prefer it if you would leave my home. As much as your warning was appreciated, you are far from welcome here, he stated stoically. I noticed, Revan answered. Here is my own warning, Obi-Wan told him. Walking over to the former Sith, Obi-Wan stared at him with cold gray. Stay away from my family. You lost your chance before, and I will not allow you to come in and try to steal them away. You will stay away from Anakin, he is in a good place, and from what Bastila has stated his future looks pretty bright. Stay away from all of us and just go back to where you came from, he explained coldly. Revan squared his shoulders. I heard your warning, but whether or not I listened to both of you is another story, he answered. Obi-Wan grabbed his lightsaber. Stay away from my family, Anakin is like my brother, so he is family, so stay away, he insisted. Don't be a foolish boy, Revan answered. Before Obi-Wan could react, Revan grabbed him by his throat and pinned him to the wall. You don't want me for your enemy, he said angrily. Nor do you want that of me, Obi-Wan answered. Before Revan could react, Obi-Wan held his hand up and made him fly backwards and crashed into the wall. Stay away from my family, Revan, this is my only warning, he snapped. Revan glared before stood up and calmly left the hovel. Hearing his daughter's cries, Obi-Wan walked over and lifted her up into his arms. "It's alright darling, it's alright," he whispered, hugging her close. He sat down on the sofa with his daughter in his arms, smiling as the little girl got over what had happened and decided to have her play with her. Obi-Wan was only happy to oblige, while his mind kept drifting back to Revan had said about Bastila's condition. He could only hope he could stop the degeneration before he lost her forever. Adam was walking up the stairs to the hovel, seeing her husband standing outside with their children. Their 6-month-old son, Rowan, was bouncing his arms, gurgling like crazy. She couldn't help but smile as she watched her husband play with their children. Anakin smiled as he cradled his son in his arms. "What are you looking at, Rowan?" he asked. "Daddy, someone coming," Luke told his father, standing up. Leia stood up, her eyes watching as a cloaked figure walked up as Anakin slowly turned around. The figure seemed to have stopped in his tracks, as if shocked to see Anakin. "Daddy," Leia murmured, hugging her father around his leg. "Leia, why don't you go inside by your mama?" he asked as he placed Rowan into his hover stroller for the twins to take back with them. Luke grabbed the hover stroller, taking his brother back, while Anakin made sure his lightsaber was still attached to his belt. "Who are you?" he asked, cautiously. "I am just a stranger passing through," the person answered. "Passing through the desert of Tatooine without some sort of speeder?" "I don't believe that," Anakin told him. The stranger reached up, removing his hood from his face. "Who are you?" Anakin demanded. "Your friend, Bastila Shan, should know me," he replied as he walked around. Anakin watched the stranger walk around and was looking at the toys that were scattered around on the ground. "The chosen one, I have seen your work in the galaxy during the Clone Wars, Anakin, or should I say, Justice," he commented. Reaching to his belt, Anakin detached his lightsaber from his utility belt and activated it. "Revan," he said in a low voice. "So you have heard of me," Revan commented. "I haven't. Obi-Wan warned me." "What are you doing on my land?" Anakin demanded. "I am here to speak with the infamous Justice," Revan replied. Anakin watched as he continued to walk around him. "As I had seen, you married a politician, not a smart move if I may comment," he added. "You may not comment, it is none of your business," Anakin answered. "Not very trustful people," Revan commented. "You sound just like the Jedi, judging people before knowing them," he answered. Revan sighed as continued circling the young man. "I'm not here to fight you, boy, I'm here to offer you the chance to become my apprentice," he told Anakin. "No, I had a great master. She taught me everything I know, she's the one who saved me from becoming a monster," Anakin replied. "Yet you have a family that could distract you from your mission," he answered. "My family are what pushed me forward to fighting for freedom in this galaxy," Anakin snapped. Revan continued to stare at the young man. "You do remind me of someone," he commented. Anakin kept his lightsaber drawn, watching Revan closely. "Someone familiar," he added. "What does it matter? You are not welcome here," Anakin snapped. "Such hostility, young Skywalker," Revan commented. "You verbally attacked Bastila and threatened Obi-Wan, unforgivable," Anakin answered. Revan stared at him when Luke ran over to his father. "Daddy," he said quietly, wrapping his arms around his father's leg. "Luke, what are you doing out here?" Anakin said softly, resting his hand on the top of his son's head. Luke glared at Revan. "You won't take Daddy away," he snapped. Anakin looked at his son with a surprised expression. "Luke, did you hear what he was thinking?" Anakin asked. The boy nodded his head slowly. Anakin couldn't help but smile as he lifted his son up after deactivating his lightsaber. "Luke, this is great," he told his son, smiling, forgetting all about Revan. The boy was smiling from ear to ear to see the pride on his father's face. "You're gaining your force abilities. This is great, son," he told his son. "I fight like you?" Luke asked. "Someday, but your powers are growing," Anakin replied. Luke smiled brightly. Anakin looked back toward Revan with narrow eyes. "Leave my land, Revan. I won't tell you again," he ordered before going back inside with his son in his arms. Walking inside, Anakin sighed as he closed the door. "Do you think he'll leave?" Padme asked. "If he doesn't, I'll have to force him to leave," he replied as he sat down with Luke in his lap. "Daddy, you won't go away again?" Luke asked. "Not again, son, I promise," Anakin replied. Anakin was still working on freeing the slaves, but was trying to avoid fighting Demonia at all costs. Even a year later, he was still determined not to kill his sister, even though she was as evil as a Sith could get after having Sidious train her. Smiling, he watched as Rowan was crawling around on the floor with his little wooden toys in his hands. Padme stood behind her husband with her hands resting on his shoulders. "What are you going to do?" she asked, resting her forehead against the top of his head. "Bastila and I have had a plan over the last 4 years of what to do. I'm not about to have some coward destroy it all," he answered. Padme sighed as she ran her hands over her husband's chest. "Let's not start another feud," she told him softly. "Hard not to, from what Bastila told me. Revan abandoned her. The woman's been like a second mother to me, so I'm just as protective of her as I am of my own mother," he answered. I know, she murmured as he stood up with Luke on his side and Leia with her arms wrapped around his leg. Rowan was gurgling as he sat on the floor. Yes, your father looks really funny, Anakin told his son, grinning a little. Padme laughed, shaking her head slowly as she crossed her arms over her chest. We need to go to Mos Eisley for some things. We're running low on food, she stated. Well, I guess we should go to Mos Eisley, then huh? He asked, smiling. The couple smiled as they got their children into the speeder. When they arrived at Mos Eisley, Padme was holding Luke's hand as they were going to the fruit stands that were lined up. I don't want pallies, Leia whined. You like pallies, Padme commented. No I don't, not more pallies, Leia told her stubbornly. Anakin lifted his daughter up into his arms. Your mama is going to buy what's good for you, he stated firmly. Leia huffed, resting her head on his shoulder. Anakin kissed his daughter's cheek while hugging her close to him. Leia started playing with the black cord around his neck. Rowan was in his hover stroller playing with his stuffed bantha when he looked over to see a stranger watching. Being 5 months old, he didn't understand what was going on. Luke looked over to see Revan watching. Daddy, he's following, Luke told his father quietly. Just ignore him, son, Anakin replied. Even though Anakin was ignoring Revan as much as he could, it was annoying him quite a bit that he couldn't be with his family without Revan following him. Now, Padme looked over at her husband to see him watching Revan closely. Ani, don't give him the attention he's wanting, she insisted. It's annoying, he muttered as he hugged Leia closer, the little girl beginning to doze on his shoulder. Shaking her head slowly, she looked down at Rowan. Your daddy acts just much like a child as you do, she quipped. Rowan gurgled in response, throwing his toy bantha on the ground. It doesn't matter, the less I watch him, he'll still follow us, he answered. Yes, but the more you watch him the more Luke watches him, and his anxiousness gets worse, Padme told him. Sighing, he nodded his head slowly. This is true too, he murmured. Looking at Luke, he held his son's hand as they went over to another food stand. Good afternoon Ami, the old woman that owned the stand greeted. Good afternoon Trella, how are you today? Padme asked as she examined the vegetables in her stand. The same old child, same old story, Trella replied. Padme smiled a little as she continued to search through the goods. Oh. Ami, I have a surprise for you, 1 second, Trella told he as she slowly stood up from her chair and went behind it. The couple glanced at each other before Trella returned with a small brown sack. My boy stopped by for a visit today, and during his last visit I told him how you and your little ones just love cloudberries, she said smiling. Opening the sack, Padme let out a gasp to see a large amount of cloudberries inside. Oh Trella, you didn't have to do this, she insisted. You're a lovely, lovely family, very generous. You save an old woman's stand from being ransacked by a bunch of raiders, may the Maker bless you, Trella answered brightly. Anyone would have done it, Padme insisted. Not on Tatooine dearie, you have been here long enough to know how cruel people are here. The last they'll do is save an old woman from being robbed, but you two show that there is still goodness in this galaxy, Trella answered. The old woman smiled at the children. Well, I must close down for the evening. Enjoy your cloudberries, she told them. Thank you very much Trella, Padme answered. Not a problem dear girl, not a problem, Trella insisted as she started closing up her shop. A sandstorm will be coming so you should get home before it hits. You have a good evening Trella, Anakin told her. The woman nodded before she hurried into her little home. I can sense a storm coming myself, we should go home, Anakin agreed. Padme nodded as she had a hold of the hover stroller, the 5 of them going back to their waiting speeder. When they arrived back home, Anakin watched his family go back into the hovel while he stood outside, staring out into the distance. Seeing the sandstorm beginning to form, he moved his speeder back into the garage, closing and locking all the doors. There wasn't a lot of time, but enough so they wouldn't lose everything. Walking over to the power generator, he made sure the emergency power was operational, just in case they had lose their main power. As he walked back to his hovel, he saw Revan watching him still. Just because you watch me, doesn't mean I'll join you. It's just making me want to. Till you, Anakin told him. Well, young one, how about a bet? Revan asked. I'm not a gambler, Anakin replied. Revan began circling the young man again. Well, I will leave you alone if you duel, he suggested. That is if I win, Anakin commented. Yes, but if I win, you will come with me and train under my rules, Revan answered. Anakin shook his head. No deal, I don't trust you enough that you wouldn't cheat to get your way, he commented. And you wouldn't? Revan asked. Bastila taught me honorability in a fight against my opponent, never would I find a way to cheat to win, and I never have, Anakin replied. Bastila shan. Honorable? Revan asked. Anakin glared at him. She's a very honorable woman, how dare you say otherwise? He snapped. The two of them circled each other and Anakin could see the sandstorm approaching. And her name is Bastila Kenobi, has been for the last 2 years, he added. Suddenly, the young man felt jealousy emanate from Revan. Kenobi the man is weak, Revan sneered. Before he could block the attack, Anakin whipped his hand up and Revan was grabbing at his throat. You will never speak ill of Obi-Wan in front of me. Like Bastila, he is honorable, brave. My brother, my family, and I will not have the likes of you to drag his name through the dirt, he snapped. The next thing Anakin knew, his force grip on Revan broke and he was thrown across his land, hitting the ground hard. Revan was catching his breath, holding his throat. You're all foolish. All of you, using love and loyalty as your powers, they are weak, he snapped between breaths. Hate and greed are evil powers, Anakin answered as he jumped to his feet. Revan whipped out his lightsaber as Anakin pulled out his own. They are weak, tell me Revan what's worth fighting in this galaxy if not for love and loyalty? Anakin asked as their lightsabers collided. Power in itself is a strength, Revan answered. Is that all you care about? Power. I know that's a lie, speaking that whenever you are forced to think of the fact Bastila is with Obi-Wan I can feel the jealousy roll off you like waves, Anakin told him. You know nothing, Revan answered. The two of them began fighting just as the sandstorm began to roll in. Even though the sand was swirling around him, Anakin had his eyes shielded, but was feeling out in the force for Revan's next attack. Sensing a blow to his head, he rolled across the ground before holding his hand up, throwing his opponent backwards. Revan stumbled a bit but was able to regain his balance. Reaching out into the force, he grabbed Anakin by the front of his tunic, throwing him to the ground, but then he pulled apart his double-sided lightsaber, holding both ends up to block a blow to his chest. Shocked, Revan dodged a blow to his side. And what if you lose your beloved wife? I know you fear of losing her, that is very evident. What are you to do if something were to happen to her? Revan asked into the young man's head. I would live as she has made me promise, live for her, live for our children. Our children would need their father if anything were to happen to their mother. Her love is eternally mine, and that is worth fighting for if she was alive or dead, Anakin replied. Anakin took aim at Revan's middle, but his blow was blocked. I would die for my family. What would you die for? He asked. The two of them continued aiming blows at each other. Having enough, Anakin kicked Revan in the chest, sending him to the ground. Walking over to Revan, he reached into the force and ripped his lightsaber from his opponent's hand before he could react. Reattaching the sides to his lightsaber, Anakin held Revan's blade in his hand. Is there nothing in this galaxy you wouldn't die for? No one you would give your life for? Power only gives so much, but then the loneliness is what kills a person slowly. Is there nothing you desire, Revan? Nothing at all. Anakin asked as he stood above him. Then kill me, Skywalker, Revan answered, if power is going to kill me. Shaking his head slowly, Anakin tossed his lightsaber into the depths of the storm before he pulled his hood up after reattaching his lightsaber to his belt. Holding his hand up, a blue force shield appeared around them both as he pulled his cloak around him to protect himself from the eye of the storm. Revan just sat in the force shield with wide eyes. Just like that, the storm passed and Anakin stood up, shaking whatever sand he had from his hair before looking at his defeated opponent. I had promised myself long ago that I would never kill out of spite, out of anger, or just because I can. I vowed to never become what I had seen myself become if it weren't for Bastila's guidance. If I had done what you had asked, I would be going down the wrong path. The path that would make me lose my wife, my children, and everything I have fought to build, he explained. Anakin turned on his heel to go back to his hovel, leaving Revan there stunned. Walking into his hovel, Padme was suddenly in his arms. What were you doing? I thought the storm would have killed you, Padme told him. I'm alright, he assured her. Resting his forehead against her temple, he held her close. Padme hugged him back, closing her eyes tight before pulling back and hitting him in the chest. Don't you ever scare me like that again, Anakin Skywalker. She scolded. Anakin chuckled, kissing his wife's forehead. I was just getting rid of Revan, he told her. Smiling, she rested her head on his chest. Anakin held onto her as he rested his forehead against the top of her head with a smile. Anakin sighed as he was preparing for his, Bastila, and Obi-Wan's next mission. Bastila, you don't need to go, he told her. Bastila shook her head slowly. Anakin, I have been cooped up for far too long. I think it's time to go on a mission, she replied while Sasha sat on her hip, playing with the cord around her neck. Bastila kissed her 2-year-old's forehead and rubbed her back. Well, unless she comes with us, she started suggesting. Absolutely not, too dangerous, Obi-Wan answered. She's a Shan, she commented. And a Kenobi, Obi-Wan answered. Sasha just giggled at her bickering parents. Funny, she giggled. We are, huh? Bastila asked, kissing her daughter's forehead. Anakin shook his head slowly with a slight chuckle when Luke ran over. The twins were 5 now and Luke was beginning his training with his father. Dad, I'm coming with you, right? He asked. Yes, you're coming, Anakin replied with a smile as he lifted Luke up onto his shoulders. Luke smiled as he rested his head on the top of his father's. Might as well get his training started since mine started late, he commented. Even Luke would be considered too old for the order, Obi-Wan commented. Bastila rolled her eyes. Please, we used to have older people join the order in my time, she answered. Luke kept his hands on his father's shoulders with a smile when Padme came out with Rowan and Leia. Ada, Rowan gurgled, holding his arms out. Anakin smiled as he took his son into his free arm, kissing the top of his head. You just be careful, Padme told him. This is a calm mission, Padme, nothing bad will happen, he answered smiling. You say that then I don't hear from you for 3 days, Padme told him. We'll keep in contact, he answered. Smiling, he pressed his lips to hers when their older children groaned in disgust. Anakin chuckled as he let his wife go. Setting his sons down, he embraced his daughter. You be good for your mother, don't be so hard on her, he whispered softly to his daughter. Okay, she replied with a sigh. Anakin kissed the top of her head, stroking her hair gently before standing back up. Are you ready? Bastila asked. Ready as we'll ever be, Anakin replied as he held Luke's hand and they boarded the ship. As they were traveling to Ossus, Anakin was sitting in the pilot's seat with Luke in his lap. Remember what I told you? He asked smiling. Yeah, Luke replied smiling. Anakin smiled as Luke started showing him what he had taught him. Fast learner, Obi-Wan commented. But he is, Anakin answered smiling proudly at his son. Bastila smiled as she was sitting on the floor with Sasha, the 2-year-old was trying to get a ball to float to her. You can do it, sweetheart, Bastila told her daughter. Sasha held her hands up and the ball just rolled a little. Anakin turned around in the pilot's chair after putting the ship on autopilot, watching Obi-Wan and Bastila with their daughter with a slight grin. Sasha was clearing getting frustrated and pouted. Like this Sasha, Luke told her as he held his hands up, making his toy fighter float around. Sasha's brown eyes grew wide as she watched the ship land in front of her, making her giggle. Ade, she replied slowly. She stared stubbornly at her toy, holding her hands up. Bastila watched with a smile as the ball rolled a little more and then lifted off the floor about an inch before falling to the ground again. That's wonderful, Sasha, Bastila told her. Not up, she pouted. No, but it's a start, Obi-Wan answered, kissing the top of his daughter's head. Sasha sighed as she tried again, but then let out a long yawn. I think you overworked yourself, little one, he commented, lifting her up off the floor. The toddler rested her head on Obi-Wan's chest, her eyes closing almost immediately. She has your calm demeanor at least, Bastila commented as she stood up from the floor. Yes, but she has your stubbornness, he replied with a slight chuckle. Chuckling lightly, Anakin sighed as he sat back in his chair while Luke was trying to get the ship to float around the room again. Alright, how about another lesson, son? Anakin suggested as he set Luke down. What? Luke asked curiously. Before Anakin could answer, he saw Bastila staring a little. What is it? He asked. Anakin, you do realize that this mission could just be a dead end. No one knows if this library is still standing, Bastila commented as she sat down in a chair. It doesn't hurt to look. If I'm the one who's supposed to defeat the Sith and put the Force back in the balance, I need to learn everything there needs to be known about the Force, Anakin replied. Do you want to learn more about the Force or try to find a way so you wouldn't have to destroy Demonia? Bastila asked curiously after Anakin sent Luke to the back of the ship to play. Anakin sighed. You said you were able to bring Starkiller back from the dark side, he answered. But Starkiller wasn't a Sith, Revan was, and you see how well he is, Bastila commented as she crossed her arms over her chest. You brought him over to your side, he answered. I was able to do that easily because he always wanted to be better than his brother. Starkiller turned on his own, I just offered him the chance, she stated. Letting out a frustrated sigh, Anakin rubbed the back of his neck. Anakin, I know how you want to bring your sister back, but you don't know how long she's been under Sidious's rule. If she never had the chance of ever being good at all, there might not be hope for her, Bastila explained. Starkiller and Revan were raised on the dark side, Anakin muttered. Yes, but Starkiller, unlike his brother, had a taste of good. He worked with the Jedi even though it was as a cover-up to destroy us, he fought with us. He saw what we were truly about, he got a taste of true power, and he wanted more of it. That's what made him change, Bastila explained. Anakin was silent. What if an Ailey doesn't want to be evil? What if she does want to change but she just doesn't know it? He suggested. You're clinging to hope that might not exist, Anakin, she answered. She doesn't now any better though, Bastila. She was raised to be what she is. Sidious could have done Force knows what to her to turn her into this. She's still an Ailey Skywalker, I can sense it, I know it, he insisted. Bastila could see the hope in his eyes, the determination to show that his sister still had good in her, but it was just buried away. Did you believe Starkiller was so evil that you couldn't convert him? Revan too? He asked. Revan's just Bantha Puto now, but a long mission is what had us close. Starkiller was my friend when we were 17-year-old kids, Anakin. I had time to convert them, where and how will you get the time to show Demonia that there is good in her? She asked. Anakin was silent as he kept staring out the window to see the stars fly by in streaks. Anakin, listen to me, if you go in there with your mind distracted, even though your shields are up, it can and will kill you, I have seen it happen, she told him. The young man stared at his former master with an emotionless expression on his face, but his eyes were giving him away. See? That is exactly what I'm talking about. Your shields are up, but your eyes give it away. You must deal with your own demons, that includes of what happened to Ailey, or it will be used against you, she explained. Is that why you haven't gotten into a real battle in thousands of years, Bastila? Since you can't deal with your own past demons? Anakin asked, catching her off guard. Bastila crossed her arms over her chest again. Anakin, this isn't about me, she replied. No, but you are telling me to not reveal in any shape or form of a weakness, when every day I can see it on your face, that you are afraid of going into a real fight. The last fight I saw you get into was on Geonosis, he told her. The former Jedi Master scoffed. Afraid. Here, I thought you knew me, she commented, shaking her head slowly. I do, that's why I'm telling you that you are lying, you are hiding something. At least you believe you are hiding something when your eyes give you away. You haven't fought a battle in years, why? There are stories and legends about what you had done, but yet now thousands of years later you are obviously trying to keep away a secret that you don't want the enemy to know about, he explained. Bastila cleared her throat, moving to leave the room. Maybe it has to do with the fact that I could feel your fear for Obi-Wan's life on Geonosis, and I wasn't even near you at that time, he told her. At the time, Obi-Wan was a friend that I didn't want to see get killed, she replied. I wasn't born yesterday, Bastila. You were scared of watching someone else you care about die in front of you because of a Sith, Anakin told her. Bastila stopped and looked back at him. Like how you lost Maddie, he added. How she trailed off. Holland has just about everything, Bastila. I know about Maddie, he answered. The woman cleared her throat again, rubbing her hands together. Maddie's death was thousands of years ago. What happened then is irrelevant to what's going on now, she replied. Really? Then how is it when he's ever mentioned your eyes suddenly get clouded over and I feel the grief rolling off you? He asked. Bastila was silent, clearing her throat. Irrelevant, she answered before walking away. Shaking his head slowly, Anakin let out a sigh as he sat down and started mulling over about what they could possibly find in the library if they found it. When they arrived on Ossus, Luke was staring out the window with wide eyes. Wow, he said quietly. Very different from Tatooine, isn't it, son? Anakin asked. The boy nodded with wide blue eyes. Chuckling, Anakin landed the ship onto the planet's surface. Bastila stared out the window with a sigh. To think Ossus used to be such a beautiful planet, she murmured. Anakin held his son's hand as they left the ship. Obi-Wan had a hold of Sasha as the 2-year-old looked around curiously. Where exactly do we start looking? Obi-Wan asked. Anywhere, I guess, Anakin replied. I think it would be safer if the children stayed on the ship with R2, Obi-Wan told him. Anakin looked at Luke, who was already trying to help them search for the library. I don't think you're going to get Luke back on the ship, he replied. Walking over, Anakin rested a hand on his son's shoulder. What does the scanner say, Luke? He asked. I can't find the library, Luke replied. Giving his son's shoulder a squeeze, they continued walking along to find the library. Walking around, Luke saw something out of the corner of his eye and stopped. Realizing his son had stopped walking, Anakin looked over at him. What are you looking at, son? He asked. The tree, Luke replied. Looking over, they saw a huge tree there. Big, Sasha murmured. They just stood there for a minute, staring at the massive tree in front of them. It's not polite to stare, the tree spoke, startling them. Luke ran behind his father frightened, and Sasha buried her face into her father's shoulder terrified. It's alright, Obi-Wan said softly, kissing her forehead gently. Who are you? Anakin demanded sternly. The question is, who are you? Are you friend or foe? The tree asked. Anakin looked at his son, then at Obi-Wan. Obi-Wan handed Sasha over to Bastila before stepping forward. I'm Jedi Master Obi-Wan Kenobi, my wife Bastila, and our friend Anakin Skywalker, he told the tree. Jedi Master, so the Order still exists, the tree commented. No, the Order has been destroyed by the Sith. The Jedi are all but extinct, we are in hiding, Obi-Wan explained. The tree fell silent. Who are you? Anakin asked again. Bnar, the tree answered. Obi-Wan's eyes grew wide and looked over at Bastila, who was standing there with wide eyes. I've heard so many stories about you, she commented. Who is he? Anakin asked. He's a needy Jedi Master. The day the planet was attacked, he turned himself into a tree to protect ancient lightsabers from Ixir Kun, Bastila replied. Anakin stared at the tree, holding his son close. Anakin Skywalker, is it? The tree asked. Yes, Anakin replied. The Force is strong with you and the child with you, Bnar told him. Bastila stood behind Anakin, her hand on his shoulder. Master Bnar, Anakin is the chosen one that prophecies have spoken of, she replied, the one who will bring balance to the Force and peace into the galaxy. Such a heavy burden, such high expectations for a boy, Bnar commented. Anakin is a powerful boy, very in control of his powers. He is able to defeat the Sith when that time comes, Bastila replied. There is a lot of conflict I sense in the boy, Bnar answered. Bastila looked at Anakin, but he refused to meet her gaze. Master Bnar, there is a lot of conflict. I want to destroy the Sith, I want to put the Force back in the balance. I have the desire and the need to raise my children in a peaceful galaxy and not one destroyed by war, Anakin explained. Luke kept his arms around his father's waist. The conflict, young one? Bnar asked. My sister is a Sith's apprentice. She never had the chance to see good in the galaxy. She was stolen from my mother. I know there's good in her, Master Bnar. The Emperor hasn't destroyed all of the innocence from her, I know it. I just want to save her and bring her home, Anakin explained. Bnar was silent for a while, and Anakin lifted Luke up, having his son sit on his side. Luke rested head on his father's shoulder. I shall teach you the ways of the Force that your Jedi friends are unable to show you. The ways that I sense have been long forgotten, Bnar explained. I would be honored, Anakin answered. Your friends as well, teach them the older ways of the Force. It could be a great advantage for all of you to learn, Bnar added. We would be honored, Master Bnar, Obi-Wan told him. Then we shall begin whenever the three of you are ready, Bnar told them. Looking at Luke, Anakin pressed a kiss to his forehead to his son's head before setting him down on the ground. Staring back at the tree, Anakin moved down to one knee. I am ready for your teachings, Master Bnar, he stated with a slight grin. As am I, Bastila answered as she set Sasha down on the ground before bending down on one knee. As am I, Obi-Wan put in before doing the same. Then let's begin, Bnar told them. Adam sighed as she was cleaning up the mess Leia and Rowan had left behind. Rowan was in his playpen fast asleep with his thumb in his mouth while Leia was on her stomach coloring. Smiling, she walked over to her daughter, stroking her hair gently. What are you doing, princess? She asked softly as she crouched down beside her daughter. Making a picture for daddy when he comes home, Leia replied. Smiling, Padme kissed the top of her daughter's head before leaving her alone to her drawing. Sighing, she rubbed her hands together when her comlink went off. Walking over, she lifted it up. Yes. She answered. Senator Amidala, Bail greeted. I'm no longer a senator, Bail. You can stop with the formalities, she answered. You are the people's senator and queen, Bail told her. Sighing, she rubbed her forehead. What is it, Viceroy? She asked. I would like for your family to come back to Alderaan, I have some matters to discuss with you, he answered. Anakin isn't here, he's off trying to find some texts that could help him with his training, Padme explained. Well, is there a way you can relay these messages to him for when he returns? Bail asked. Sitting in silence, she looked over at her two children before answering, I'll be there as soon as I can. After turning off her comlink, she went to prepare for a trip to Alderaan. Standing at the entrance of the smaller ship Anakin left for any sort of purpose, Padme looked over at Shmai. Mama, can Grandma come? Leia asked, holding on to Shmai's hands. If she would like to, Padme answered, looking at her mother-in-law. Shmai laughed a little. Oh, I would just be in the way, she answered as she stroked her granddaughter's hair. No, Grandma, please. Please, you have to come, Leia insisted, tugging on her hands. Padme laughed a little. Mother, she's not going to stop begging until you come, she commented. Shmai laughed softly. Alright, I'll come, Shmai answered. Let me pack a few things and say goodbye to Grandpa. Leia beamed before she ran onto the ship. When they arrived at Alderaan, Organa was waiting for them on the landing platform. Senator, hello, Bail greeted as she walked off the ship. I'm not a senator anymore, Viceroy, you don't need to continue to call me that, Padme insisted as she lifted Rowan up. As I said before, you are the people's senator, he answered. Padme smiled a little as she followed him inside. What is it you needed to speak with me about? She asked. I have an idea that I would also like to run by with your husband, he answered. What is it? She asked. Before he could reply, a young child ran up to them. She had waist-length honey blonde hair that was braided gray eyes, she was wearing little white boots, a light purple dress that had a ribbon belt around her waist. Papa. She said, smiling. What is it, Nayla? He asked, smiling as he squatted down in front of the child. Nayla held up a rope kind of bracelet. I made this, she replied. Bail smiled as he took the bracelet. How wonderful, you are very talented, he told his daughter. You will wear it all the time? She asked. Always, he replied, kissing her forehead. Padme smiled as Nayla looked up at her. Hi. She greeted, smiling. Well, hello, Padme greeted, smiling. What's your name? Nayla asked. My name is Padme, this is my son Rowan, and my daughter Leia, Padme replied. Leia smiled at the girl. Hi, she greeted. Nayla smiled at her. Want to play? She asked. Leia nodded before the girls ran off to play. Leia is growing into a beautiful little girl, Bail commented. Thank you, so is Nayla, Padme answered. Thank you, he said with a slight smile. Padme watched as the girls played in the gardens together. I just wished there was peace in the galaxy again. It kills Anakin and me that we can't raise the children on Naboo like we wanted, she said softly. Shmai rested her hand on her daughter-in-law's shoulder. We were all hoping to be on Naboo by now, Shmai told her gently. Padme let out a sigh. I'm a wanted person, my children are in constant danger because of me, she murmured. She let out a sigh as she looked at her son, kissing his forehead. I wish we could just go away from here, leaving everything behind and raise our children, she said softly. Are you saying you'd like to run away, Padme? Shmai asked. For a while, just to raise our children. I want them to live in peace, live them as happy children. I mean, look at Leia. She's the happiest girl in the galaxy right now. I want to see them go to school as well as learn how to control their powers, she explained. Shmai nodded her head slowly in understanding, knowing that Anakin and Padme only wanted the best for their children. However, on a Star Destroyer, Demonia was walking along the bridge with her hood drawn over her head. What is it, Captain? She asked, clearly annoyed. Milady, we have searched the planets you have ordered, but we can't find a trace of justice, he stated fearfully. Demonia narrowed her yellow eyes. You disrupted my meditation for this? She answered, her voice low. Why you wanted the report about our search, he told her. If you found something, Captain, she hissed. The captain cowered from her. You spineless fools, she hissed. Milady, a lieutenant called. What? She snapped. The lieutenant stopped, clearing his throat. Milady, the Emperor has sent a message wanting to hear news on your search for justice, he told her. Fine, she answered before leaving the bridge. Walking into her chambers, she bowed down to one knee. What is thy bidding, my master? She asked. Sidious's hologram appeared in front of her. What is the status of finding justice? He asked. He is nowhere to be found, my master. I suspect that he isn't as brave as we thought. He is cowering away like the fool he is, she replied. He is too busy protecting the former senator of Naboo, Sidious told her. She is no longer a threat, my lord. She has no political powers anymore. Her followers are now our followers, she pointed out. Sidious cackled lightly. Yes, you have done well, my apprentice, he told her. Thank you, my master, she answered, bowing her head. When you find justice, bring him before me, he ordered. It will be done, master, she answered obediently. Sidious's image disappeared and she stood up. As she went to go back to her quarters, she stopped suddenly. Give her back. Give her back. A voice echoed in her head. Stopping, her eyes widened when she saw a young woman with long dark hair and brown eyes. Shaking her head, she let out an unsteady breath, leaning against the wall. When another image tried to push into her head, she shook her head furiously. No, stop, she hissed, sliding down the wall. When the images faded, she let out a deep breath. Back on Ossus, Anakin was meditating, opening his eyes. He let out a heavy sigh. You sound defeated, young Skywalker, Bnar commented. I am still trying to reach out to my sister, Master Bnar, Anakin answered as he stood up from the ground. Ah yes, to an Ailey, Bnar answered. Anakin lowered his head slightly. I don't want to give up on her, Master Bnar, he insisted. You have faith that your sister can be saved, Bnar observed. Well yes, she's never seen true goodness in this galaxy, Anakin answered. You believe you can instill some goodness in her? Bnar asked. The young man nodded. Someone has to, she's been shown nothing but evil. I want to give her the choice of either serving the Emperor or helping us defeat him, he insisted. It seems you have your mind made up, young one, Bnar answered. I have, even though it isn't the decision Bastila and Obi-Wan have been hoping for, Anakin told him. Tell me, Anakin, did you meditate on this with the Force? He asked. Yes, Anakin answered. The old Jedi Master was silent. What is the Force telling you, young one? Bnar asked. That she can be saved, Anakin replied. Then do what must be done to save her, Bnar told him. Anakin nodded his head slowly before he went to go find his son. Back on Alderaan, Padme was in the gardens with her children. Mommy, look, Leia said, smiling as she showed her mother a flower. How beautiful, princess, she said, smiling. Taking the flower, she placed it into her daughter's hair. Mommy, I miss Daddy and Luke, Leia told her. Padme let out a sigh. I miss them too, sweetheart, but they'll be home, she answered, smiling. Padme kissed her daughter's forehead, having her sit in her lap. Humming softly, she started swaying back and forth with her daughter in her arms. I like it here, Mommy, can we stay? She asked. Padme rested her cheek on the top of her daughter's head. We can only stay a little while, sweetheart, she replied. Why? Leia asked. Mommy has bad people looking for her, and if we stay too long they'll find us here, Padme replied. She kissed the top of her head. If we could, I'd take you to my home. It's so beautiful, she said softly. Leia snuggled up to her mother, closing her eyes. When night fell, Padme was putting the children to bed. Leia was snuggling under her blankets with her favorite stuffed toy in her arms. Smiling, Padme kissed her daughter's forehead. Sweet dreams, little one, she whispered, kissing the side of her head before standing up. Sitting out on the terrace, Padme was relaxing with a sigh. Closing her eyes, she tilted her head back and began to drift off when she heard footsteps come up behind her. Getting up, she saw Anakin standing there. "Ani," she gasped. Hurrying over, she threw her arms around her husband's neck. Letting out a sigh, Anakin hugged her tight, resting his forehead against the top of her head as he lifted her up off the ground. "I missed you," he told her softly. "I missed you so much," she answered, closing her eyes tight. Setting her down, he placed his hands on her face and kissed her tenderly. Kissing him back, she placed her hands on the sides of his neck. "Why didn't you tell me you were coming? How did you know I was here?" she asked. "Mom left a message on my comm on the ship," he replied. Smiling, she rested her hands on his arms. Standing up on her tiptoes, she pressed her lips against his. Anakin kissed her back, wrapping his arms around her back. "I have to talk to you about something," he told her as they sat down. "What is it?" she asked as she sat beside him. Holding her hands in his, he ran his thumb over her wedding ring. "Well, we are searching for Mama Naden," he told her. "Who is that?" she asked. "He's someone who could help us return Ossus into a livable planet. A place where we can raise our children, Padme. Can't you imagine it? A place that has life on it. A planet where it has everything we've wanted to raise our children on happily. We wouldn't have to worry about Tusken Raiders or rogue slave traders," he explained. Adam stared at him with wide eyes. "You mean you can make it look livable again?" she asked. "Yes," he replied. He held onto her hands. "A planet that is safe for us to raise our children on it, one we can bring the slaves I have freed to, so they could live their own lives," he told her. "What about your mom?" she asked. "She can come with us, everyone can come with us," he replied. "Anakin, I doubt the rest of the family would be willing to relocate," she told him. Gripping her hands, he let out a sigh. "They will when I tell them that it'll keep them protected when they make the connection that the Lars family is my family," he replied. "Do you think they'll make that much of a link?" "I thought you deleted your mother's record so she couldn't be found," she asked. "Bounty hunters are out for us, Padme. It'll be only a matter of time before they pinpoint Tatooine as the planet where we have been hiding all this time," he replied. Closing her eyes, she let out a sigh. "What has happened to the galaxy, Ani? To where we have to rebuild a planet just to live on it peacefully with our children," she whispered. Standing up, she let his hands go and made her way over to the stone railing, leaning against it. "I can't help but wish we could just stay on Alderaan forever, raise the children here. I pictured them running through the gardens. I could somehow get back into my work while you can continue with your work," she explained. Getting up, he walked over to her and stood behind her, looking out at the moonlit lands. "The galaxy we knew is gone, Padme. Sidious destroyed it with all his lies and deceit. He was so devious in his ways that he fooled everyone," he explained. Feeling her frustration, he wrapped his arms around her waist, pressing a kiss to the back of her head. "I can't stand this, Anakin. I can't stand it at all," she whispered. "I know, Angel," he whispered. Sighing, he rested his forehead against the top of her head. "Everything will be alright," he whispered. "It's not fair," she whispered. "I know," he answered. They were sitting in silence when Padme let out a sigh. "I'm going with you when you go to help those who have been captured by slave traders," she told him. "It's too dangerous," he objected. "I'm going to help you whether you agree with it or not," she answered, looking over her shoulder at him. "You know I'll follow you anyways." Chuckling, he held her close as they sat in silence on the terrace. Anakin smiled as he changed Rowan after bathing him. Rowan let out little noises, kicking his feet against his father's hands. Smiling, he lifted his son up into his arms. The baby stared at him as he reached up, burying his tiny hands into Anakin's hair. Smiling, Anakin his forehead, rocking him back and forth in his arms. Walking down the hall, Anakin took a peek into his and Padme's room to find his wife sitting on the bed, telling the twins stories. The twins were listening to her words with wide eyes, making him smile. Anakin never saw his wife as happy as she was on Alderaan. Sadly, he hated that they had to turn Ossus back into a livable planet. Hopefully Padme would love living there more than she had on Tatooine. Looking down at Rowan, he stroking his cheek. The baby whimpered softly, gripping his father's hand. "Having fun?" Padme asked, smiling. "It's hard to believe how big these children are getting," he commented. "I know, it's incredible," she answered as the twins ran off to play. Anakin sat beside his wife and she smiled softly, looking at Rowan. "They're the hope for the future," Anakin murmured. "Well, we shouldn't put too much weight on their shoulders," Padme answered. Looking at his youngest, Anakin stroked his cheek as he began to doze off in the crook of his arm. "We won't, they're going to be oblivious to the evils of the galaxy until they are old enough to understand. When they are old enough to understand that they are being trained to help with our cause. Right now, they're going to believe they are going to live happy, normal lives the best they can," he murmured. "I agree," she answered. Rowan's little eyes popped open and he began whimpering, wanting his pacifier. Padme found the pacifier in question, popping it into his mouth. The infant was immediately calm and fell back to sleep. Padme smiled as she looked at the baby boy. He had her nose and her mouth while had his father's eyes and face shape. "He's the perfect mixture of both of us," she murmured. Smiling, he kissed the top of his wife's head before he lied back on the bed, having Rowan rest on his chest. Padme lied down on her side, stroking her husband's hair. "You haven't been sleeping again," she said softly. "It's just dreams about an Ailey," he replied. Padme sighed as she rested her hands on her husband's. Anakin smiled up at his wife as she leaned forward, pressing her lips to his in a kiss. Anakin kissed her back, his hand on the back of her neck. Later that afternoon, Padme walked outside to see Anakin playing with the twins in the gardens. He had Leia by her arms and was swinging the giggling child around in circles. "Anakin, don't hurt her," she said laughing. "Don't worry," he answered as he set the giggling girl down on the ground. Again, she said excitedly, holding her arms up. Instead of swinging her up, he lifted her up and playfully tossed her into the air. My turn. Luke insisted, pulling on his father's belt. Padme laughed softly, shaking her head slowly. Anakin put Leia down on the ground, grabbing his son and doing the same. While she watched her husband play with her children, she looked over when Bail walked over to her. "Padme, your family's going to have to hide in one of our rooms," he told her. "Why, what's going on?" she asked. "Darth Demonia is on her way here. Usually she doesn't arrive for another month, but she's here today to find out if we are hiding any spies," he replied. Her eyes growing wide, Padme looked over at her husband. "She'll sense Anakin for sure," she said softly. Hurrying over to her husband, she held onto his arm. "Anakin, we have to go," she told him. "What's going on?" he asked. "Demonia is coming," she replied. Anakin looked at the children to see that they were staring at their parents curiously. "Padme, just take the children and go into our room, stay there," he told her. "What are you doing?" she asked. "To talk to my sister," he replied. Padme's eyes went wide. "Anakin," she started. I have to talk to her," he answered. He had the twins go over to their mother. "Just trust me," he whispered. He rested his hand on her cheek before grabbed the hood to his cloak and left to go spy on Bail and Demonia. Climbing up into the ventilation shaft, Anakin quietly made his way through finding the throne room where Bail was meeting with Demonia. He was standing up right above their heads, shielding his force energy so Demonia couldn't sense him. "I have heard you are hiding spies here," Demonia sneered. "I don't know who is giving you such information, Lady Demonia, but there aren't spies here," Bail answered. Anakin quietly made his way out of the ventilation shaft, landing behind Demonia. "So, it seems to run into you in the oddest places," Anakin commented behind her. Demonia smirked before turning around. "Well, Justice, so we meet again," she sneered. Anakin smiled under his hood. "What's the matter, no armor today?" she asked as she removed her lightsaber from her belt. Anakin unclipped his own lightsaber, activating both sides. "Bail, you should go," Anakin told his friend. Bail left the room, and the two of them circled each other. "You are a fool, Justice, you will lose," she commented. "You are so overconfident," Anakin answered. Demonia glared at him as she raised her weapon. Anakin anticipated her attack, pulling apart his lightsaber to use both sides as she ran at him in full force. Holding his weapons in an X above his head, he blocked her red blade, kicking her in the stomach. She hissed, aiming her lightsaber to his stomach, which he easily blocked. Instead of fighting back, he only blocked the attacks aimed for him. "Fight me, you coward," she hissed. Seeing her hold her hand up to force push him, Anakin quickly deactivated one lightsaber, blocking her attack. They were both using the force to try to push each other. They both struggled under each other's powers, but then Anakin took advantage, kicking her in the stomach. Demonia hit the ground with a groan, but she stood up and threw her lightsaber at his head. Rolling out of the way, Anakin grabbed his other lightsaber, jumping back to his feet, while Demonia called her lightsaber back to her hand. She ran at him, thrusting her lightsaber to his side. Anakin blocked the attack before grabbing her arm and throwing her over his shoulder. She hissed in anger and pain before she kicked up with her foot, her boot connecting to his stomach. When he stumbled back, Demonia stood up with her hand raised. Anakin held up his hands, blocking the attack aimed at him. Demonia made her way over to Anakin while firing lightning at him. She backed him up against the wall before she grabbed him around the throat. "Now, Justice, let's see your face," she hissed. Reaching up, she grabbed a hold of his hood and ripped it down from his face. When she saw her opponent's face, her eyes grew wide. Suddenly every vision she ever had in her whole life came back to her like a tidal wave. The little boy running over a woman who was down on her knees with her arms wide open to embrace him. The teenager who was practicing his lightsaber training with his master. The young man who was down on one knee in front of Senator Amidala while presenting a ring. The 21-year-old standing in his justice armor without his mask. Demonia's eyes were wide, and Anakin watched as they went from yellow to emerald green. "What kind of mind trick is this?" she hissed, letting him go. "It's not a mind trick," he answered, holding his throat. Demonia glared at him as she grabbed her lightsaber, holding it to his throat. "Who are you?" she hissed. Anakin stared at her with no fear in his face whatsoever. My name is Anakin Skywalker, and your name is Ailey Skywalker, he replied confidently. Demonia stared at him. There's no fear in your eyes, she told him. You won't kill me, he replied. She held the weapon closer to his throat. Don't test me, she hissed. Really? Why didn't you kill me during our first duel? I was in pain from my vision, you had the chance to kill me then, but yet you didn't, he answered. Your stupid master stopped me. She hissed. Anakin shook his head slowly. No, you felt that connection only a brother and sister have. You know I'm your brother and you are my sister, he replied. Impossible. She hissed. Is it? He asked. Before she could fight the visions, Anakin reached into her mind. She saw their mother sitting on a little bed, cradling her newborn children in her arms. My precious children, both of them, she cooed softly. She kissed them both on the foreheads. Anakin and Ailey, she whispered, hugging them close. Demonia shook her head slowly. Stop. She hissed, letting him go, holding her head. You wouldn't be fighting so hard if it weren't true, Anakin answered as he walked over to her. Demonia glared, raising her lightsaber to him. Don't come any closer. She hissed. Anakin called for her lightsaber, tossing their weapons aside, closing and locking the door so she couldn't call for their weapons. He carefully walked around her as she was fighting against the visions. You didn't want to kill me before and I believe you won't kill me now, he told her. Demonia stopped, her eyes narrowing as they turned yellow again. You underestimate the power of the dark side, she hissed. She reached into her utility belt, grabbing her spare lightsaber, charging at Anakin with it. Anakin jumped over her head, pulling out his vibroblade from his utility belt. Jumping over the lightsaber she aimed at his feet, Anakin jumped over her head before turning around and blocked an attack towards his head. You remember our mother, you feel her through the Force. You saw her face in your dreams, Anakin told her. Stop. She hissed. Why? For speaking the truth? He demanded. She let out a hiss before aiming her lightsaber at his head again. Anakin grabbed her wrist and threw her on the floor. Before she could jump up, he pinned her to the floor, pinning her arms by her head and moved so she couldn't kick him. Look and pay attention. Let us in, Ailey. Let us in. He exclaimed as he grabbed her head, concentrating to show her the truth of her life. Lies. All lies. She screamed as she tried to fight the visions. Anakin broke through the barrier she tried to put up, showing her everything about their mother. To try to erase whatever lies Sidious put into her head. Outside, Padme could hear Demonia's screams as she was fighting against Anakin. Looking over, she saw Shmai standing there with tears in her eyes. 25 years and I know that's her, Shmai said softly. Padme walked over, hugging Shmai as she cried softly. Anakin saw that she wasn't going to listen to him this way, he got off her, and Demonia just glared at him. Lifting her hand, she threw more lightning at him, but he blocked it easily. No matter how many times you try to throw lightning at me and try to choke me, it won't work, he told her. What do you want with me? She hissed. To become an Ailey Skywalker like you are supposed to be, he replied. I am Demonia. She snapped. Anakin shook his head slowly as he closed his eyes, letting out a deep breath. He suddenly could feel his mother's presence outside the door. She's here, but I can't let her in. Do you have any idea how long she's been waiting to see you? To hold you again? He asked. She abandoned me, Demonia hissed. No, you were stolen away from us, he replied. Demonia continued to lay on the floor glaring up at him. We were slaves, Ailey. All three of us, you and I were born into slavery. They took you from us and sold you, he explained. He watched her eyes go from yellow to green again. He slowly kneeled down on the floor beside her, resting his hands on her face this time. Ailey, you are supposed to be my sister, Shmai's daughter. You were supposed to grow up loved and adored, he explained. He swallowed hard. We were supposed to grow up together, we were supposed to protect each other, but fight too. I'm supposed to try to scare every guy you tried to introduce us to. You're supposed to be the aunt to my children, maybe my wife's best friend, he explained. He kept his hands on her face, this time not aggressive, but this time with kindness and love that he always had for his sister. Ailey, things aren't supposed to be this way, he told her. Anakin felt his heart break when he felt like he wasn't getting through to her. You're supposed to be my sister, Ailey. My sister, not a slave to the Emperor, he told her. Demonia was staring at him, unsure of what to do when she saw that he was about to break down. We have a bond. A bond that no one can tear apart. We grew in the same womb at the same time, we have a brother-sister bond that no one can tear apart. Tell me you feel that bond, he insisted. Demonia just continued to stare, and Anakin felt his world start to crumble little by little as he let her go again, standing up from the floor. He turned his back, ready to leave the room, and he was ready to give up. Can I see her? Mom? She asked suddenly. Anakin turned around as she slowly stood up from the floor. Why? He demanded, not knowing what to expect. I remember, I see her face as clearing as I see yours. I've always seen her face and yours. Growing up, the visions I got from my meditation or my dreams, she explained. He saw the tears well up in her eyes. I never knew who you were until now, she replied. Anakin walked over and hugged her tight. I knew I could bring you back, I knew it, he murmured. Ailey hugged him back, closing her eyes tight. I'll go get Mom, he told her. Letting her go, he walked over to the door and unlocked the door. He held out his hand to Shmai, who took his hand, and he led her inside. Shmai let out a gasp as she stared at her daughter. Oh my maker, she whispered, her hands over her nose and mouth as she stared at her daughter. Walking over slowly, Shmai reached up and touched her daughter's face. Oh, you're so beautiful. She gasped. Ailey placed her hands over her mother's with tears in her eyes. I missed you, Ailey told her. Shmai hugged her tight with tears in her eyes. I've missed you, she whispered, stroking her hair. She held her arm out to Anakin, who walked over and hugged her and Ailey tight. I am complete, I have my children in my arms, she whispered as she continued to hug them. Now I am complete. Anakin was in the gardens playing with Rowan while Padme was watching. Ailey walked over, standing beside her. He's an amazing father, she commented. Padme looked over at her. Yes, he is, Padme replied. Anakin was lying on the ground, having Rowan stand on his stomach. Rowan was gurgling, trying to jump up and down. I am very grateful to Bastila for taking Anakin under her wing. I don't want to imagine what would have happened if the Jedi trained him, Padme added. Ailey stared at her quizzically. But he knows the Jedi arts, Ailey told her. So do you, Padme answered. Anakin slowly stood up from the ground when he saw his sister and wife talking. He let out a sigh, looking at his son when his comlink went off. Anakin, he answered. Anakin, it's Bastila. We have a slave ship heading towards Tatooine, Bastila informed him. How far away from Alderaan? He asked as he handed Rowan to Padme. A few parsecs, Bastila replied. I'm on my way there. I'm on my way as well, he told her. Padme looked at her husband. Where are you going? She asked. There's a slave ship nearby, he replied as he hurried down the hall. Just leave them, Anakin, Ailey told her brother. Anakin glanced over his shoulder at her as he started pulling on his armor. My mission is to free all the slaves, so another family won't have to suffer like we did, he told her. I'm going with you, Padme told him. She placed Rowan on the bed as she walked into her closet, changing into her battle suit. Padme, no, this is dangerous, he told her. Anakin, I have been hunted since I was 14, she answered. She clipped her belt around her waist, putting her blaster into its holster. Anakin shook his head slowly before he put his mask on. Padme grabbed her cloak, pulling it around her shoulders, and pulled her hood over her head. I know you don't understand what to do, Ailey, but stay here, Anakin told his sister before he and Padme left, leaving Ailey there unsure of what to do. The young woman sat down with her head in her hands. Her head was throbbing from all the changes she was going through. She pressed her hands to her temples, crying out softly in pain. As Anakin made his way to his ship, he winced when his head started throbbing. Ani, Padme called to her husband. She rested her hands on his shoulders. Anakin, what's the matter? She asked. My head, he replied, groaning softly. Just like that, the pain disappeared and he stood up. Are you alright? She asked. Yes, I'm alright, he replied. Letting out a deep breath, he held her hand as they went up the ramp to the ship, brushing off the little incident. On the ship, Anakin flew off with his wife beside him as they went to track down this ship. I had a feeling the Hutts were going to continue to do business, he commented. Remembering his torture under Gardulla, the Hutt's hands made his skin crawl. Of all the times he screamed and cried for his mother as she ruthlessly beat him for any little mistake. 4-year-old Anakin screamed in pain with tears in his eyes. Mommy. Mama. He shouted in pain. Please. Please, Gardulla, have mercy. He is only a child. Please, Shmai begged. Stupa pedunky. Gardulla snapped. Stupid boy. The little boy screamed some more as her whip connected to his back. Gardulla. Pay. Ma Jori. Ma Konia Jori. Konia Urga. Shmai shouted frantically. Please. My son. My only son. Only child. The Hutt stopped beating the boy with a huff. Yumda huha. Yacha huha loya ma pasti. Gardulla ordered. Get rid of them. Take them out of my sight. Anakin felt his mother lift him up into her arms as they were led to the room. His mother had placed him on the bed and was placing Bacta onto his whip marks while singing a soft lullaby to him. Anakin shook his head slowly from the memory. The more he thought of the torture Gardulla put him through, the angrier it made him. The fact she beat an innocent child without mercy disgusted him. He didn't want to think of what else the Hutts had done. Seeing her husband's spaced-off look, she rested her hand over his arm. Ani, she said softly. I'm alright, Padme, he answered. He rested his hand over hers, kissing her knuckles. I'm just remembering, he murmured. Leaning forward, she pressed her lips to his shoulder. I'm proud of you, she said softly. Smiling, he leaned forward and rested his forehead against the top of her head. And I love you, she said softly. And I love you, he answered. He moved his fingers down her back with a sigh. I am disgusted with the galaxy, Padme. I am disgusted that even though I have destroyed the ring that started slavery, it still exists, he told her. Bastila told you that slavery wouldn't be destroyed overnight, she pointed out. I know, but you would think that the slavers would disperse because of the fear. They are nothing but cowards, he answered. Biting her lower lip, she entwined her fingers with his free hand. Anakin, if things could be solved so easily, then defeating the Emperor would be a quick fix, she pointed out. I know, he said softly. Standing up, she moved behind him with her arms around him. I can't imagine what Sidious did to her, Pan. She was only a baby when she was taken from us. She was manipulated for so long, he said softly. Are you doubting that she is back? She asked. I'm not doubting that she has come to our side. What I'm worried about is how much damage he had done to her. Is it reversible? He asked. She ran her hand over his arm. Maybe after this mission you two should talk about it. You should get to know her more even though you might not like the way she was brought up, she explained. He nodded his head slowly. The last conversation he ever wanted to have was to hear what Sidious did to his sister all her life. Even though he was a slave to Gardella the Hutt, he could only imagine being Sidious's slave is a lot more worse. He brainwashed her, made her believe that her family didn't love it. That infuriated him, to know that his sister grew up believing her family didn't love her. When every day all these years, his mother did nothing but think about her. She kept an Ailey a secret from him, but with good reason. She wanted to protect him from the more evils of the galaxy. He was already experiencing so much, it wouldn't have been right to expose him to even more violence. He couldn't imagine the pain his mother went through. Just the thought of losing his children pulled at his heartstrings. He couldn't imagine his life without his children. For Shmai to go so long without knowing her daughter's well-being was probably torture. When she was able to watch him grow up, he was sure she couldn't help but wonder what kind of environment his sister was being raised in. Back on Alderaan, Ailey was watching her niece and nephew play in the gardens. Her head started to hurt again as more memories of her horrible childhood tried to rear their ugly heads. She didn't want to remember. At that moment, she had no desire to even return to Sidious's side as his apprentice. She was angry, she had every right to be angry. All her life she was told that her mother never loved her, that she was sent away for money. Her mother was forced to choose between her and her brother, and she picked Anakin over her. For so long, she wanted to find her family and kill them for their betrayal. Seeing how Anakin was, when she saw the memories that Shmai had, it brought something back to her that she had lost so long ago. They gave her back her soul that Sidious tore away. It wasn't fully back, but it was a start. As she sat there, she let out a shaky breath when she heard footsteps. Looking over her shoulder, she saw Shmai standing there. I hope I'm not interrupting, Shmai commented. Not at all, Ailey replied, moving over on the stone bench. Smiling softly, Shmai sat beside her. I still can't get over how beautiful you are, she commented. She reached up, touching her daughter's cheek when she noticed a long scar along her daughter's jawline. How, she started. Battle scars, Ailey replied quickly. She lowered her eyes to the ground. I'm sure my brother has plenty of them as well, she added. Shmai sighed as she rested her hand on her daughter's shoulder. I know you are confused, Shmai murmured. The young woman couldn't help but laugh. That is the understatement of the century. All my life all I have ever known was being Lady Demonia, the heir to Darth Sidious's growing empire. It's all I've known, it's all I've been trained to be, she explained. Ailey lowered her eyes as she traced one of the scars around her wrists. Did he hurt you, sweetheart? Shmai asked softly. Ailey was silent, her emerald eyes glazed over with memories. That is a subject I don't think we should get into today, mother, she answered softly. Shmai nodded slowly, letting out a shaky breath. I have brought you something, Shmai told her. Looking over, the young woman watched as her mother pulled out a cream-colored cord with a stone in the shape of a wing. Your brother has the other, she said softly as she placed the cord around her neck. Ailey smiled as she touched the stone. It's the shape of a canary, which I find the most innocent and gentlest birds in the galaxy. Their sole purpose is to sing and fly happily, Shmai explained. It's beautiful, Ailey answered. Shmai embraced her daughter tightly with tears in her eyes. I always knew I'd see you again, I always knew I'd be holding you in my arms, she whispered. Ailey hugged her mother back with tears in her eyes. Shmai let out a shaky breath as she rested her forehead against her daughter's shoulder, letting out a small sob. Feeling the emotions take over, Ailey let out a sob as she clung to her mother tighter. I remember seeing you in my dreams, I remember, she sobbed. Shmai hushed her softly, stroking her hair. You're home now, sweetheart, you're home, Shmai whispered, and no one will ever take you away from us again. Ailey nodded, sniffling. I'm home, I'm finally home, she answered. Back on the ship, Anakin let out a deep breath as he stood up from the chair when Padme activated the cloaking device. What is the plan? Padme asked as she made sure her blaster was ready. We go in and take out whoever is a threat, he replied. He made sure his lightsaber was attached to his utility belt. Obi-Wan and Bastila are already here, he told her. You sensed them? She asked. Nodding his head slowly, he let out a deep breath as their ship went underneath the smuggler's ship. "Alright, here we go," he murmured. Looking back at his wife, he held her hand in his. "Padme, listen to me, if anything happens I want you to get into the ship and go back home," he told her. "Anakin," she started. "Do it, please." "If not for me then our children," he answered. Sitting there in silence, she nodded her head slowly and hugged him tight. Anakin hugged her back before kissing her gently. "I love you," he whispered. "I love you," she answered. Just as the ship had attached itself to the smuggler's ship. Walking over, Anakin had her go up first before going in after her. On the smuggler's ship, Anakin waved his hand for Padme to stand behind him. Pulling on his mask, he reached for his vibroblade. Going up behind a guard, he covered his mouth and held the blade to his throat. Dragging the man to the side, he pressed his fingers to his temple and sent the man to sleep. Tying him up, he looked at his wife. "These guards get shorter and shorter every time," he muttered. Padme bit her lip to keep herself from laughing. "Put his stuff on, we'll need you to walk around and find where the slaves are," he told her. Nodding, she started putting on the guard's uniform while Anakin looked around the spot they were hiding when he felt Obi-Wan and Bastila's 4 signatures. "Obi-Wan and Bastila are here," he told her. "Where are they?" she asked. "They're close, that's all I know. It's too dangerous to use the comlink," he replied. Looking over, he saw that his wife was ready. "Just find the slaves," he told her. Nodding her head slowly, she rested her fingers on his cold mask before she made her way through the corridors. Standing up, Anakin made his way through the dark to keep an eye on Padme to make sure nothing happened to her while she searched for the slaves. He saw a smuggler heading in her direction. Padme snapped to attention as the smuggler walked by her. Swallowing hard, Anakin stood in the shadows. Just as he walked closer, Anakin grabbed his arm as he threw him to the floor. When the man tried to shout, Anakin held his vibroblade to his throat. "You smuggler slime disgust me," he hissed. "Please, mercy, mercy, I'll do anything," the smuggler begged fearfully. Anakin looked up at Padme to see her watching him carefully. "You find slavery fine. Alright, then you get to become what you smuggle," he told the smuggler. He grabbed the smuggler's throat. "How many slaves are on this ship?" he demanded. "D20, the smuggler gagged out. "Men, women, and children," Anakin demanded. The smuggler shook his head. Just children," the smuggler answered. Anakin's blood boiled. "Where are they?" he demanded. The smuggler's eyes widened in fear. "Why, your partner is standing above them," he replied. Anakin threw him to the floor and had Padme back up. Holding up his hand, he lifted the top off. His heart sank when he saw 20 terrified children inside. "Oh, justice," Padme gasped, her hand over her mouth in shock. "Let them out," he told her. At that moment, Obi-Wan and Bastila had met up with them, and they began helping Padme get the children from the compartment. "Alright then, you get to find the beauties of slavery," Anakin told the smuggler before throwing him into the same prison he had kept the children. Once the top was closed, they noticed that the children were terrified of Anakin. Reaching up, he removed his mask, setting it aside. "It's alright young ones," he told them. "Mr. Justice, my sister is gone," a little boy told him with tears in his gray eyes. Anakin crouched down in front of the boy. "What's your name?" he asked. Tyro twin sir," the boy replied. "What's your sister's name?" he asked. "Sariari twin sir," Tyro replied. "Is she older?" he asked. Tyro nodded his head slowly. "He lied sir, there's girls in the one next to us. They kept us separated," Tyro replied. Anakin removed the top and they saw 6 young women dressed in the revealing slave clothes. "We need to cover them. It looks like these girls were going to Jabba," Anakin commented. Bastila's eyes were wide as Obi-Wan and Anakin helped the girls from their prison. "Obi-Wan, they can't be any older than 15 or 16, she said softly. Padme felt tears in her eyes as she watched as Obi-Wan and Anakin found blankets to cover the terrified girls up in. Opening up the other compartment, Anakin pulled out his lightsaber, activating it. "You have some information to give, smuggler," he sneered. "I told you everything I know," the smuggler answered. "Do not lie to me, I just found your young women slaves." "You disgust me, these are just young women. Some of them haven't reached their age, and you have put them in these revealing clothes to sell like they were animals," Anakin snapped. The smuggler glared, but then Anakin slammed him up against the wall, frightening the children and young women behind him. "Where is Sariari twin?" he demanded. "I know no such name," the smuggler answered. Anakin glared and held his hand up, squeezing his larynx. "Where is Sariari twin?" he demanded. "No such girl," the smuggler answered, gagging. "Where is the girl who you stole with this little boy?" Anakin demanded. The man kept gagging for air, but Anakin made sure he could still breathe. "Nal Hutta," the man gagged. Anakin's eyes widened. "You left her on the Hutt homeworld," he exclaimed. Padme let out a gasp as Anakin threw the man down on the floor, holding up his lightsaber. "Justice," Bastila shouted to her former apprentice. Anakin stopped from stabbing his lightsaber through his middle. I have taught you many things but not to kill an unarmed man. If you kill him you would be no better than a Sith, Bastila told him. Shaking, Anakin deactivated his lightsaber before tossing the unconscious smuggler's body by Obi-Wan's feet. Send him to Tatooine, let Gardulla the Hutt deal with him, he told them. Where are you going? Padme asked as her husband put his mask on. I'm going to find Tyro's sister. Take them to Ossus. Any slaves we find will come there with us until we can find their families or more permanent homes, he explained. Tyro looked up at Anakin as he squatted down in front of him. I will find your sister, I promise Tyro, he told him. The little boy nodded and they went to take the children to Ossus while Anakin went to Nal Hutta. When they arrived at Ossus, Padme looked around with wide eyes as the children ran around, not caring at the moment of how abandoned the planet was. It was the fact they were free. They had to return to Alderaan to pick up Shmai and the children. And Ailey had to return to her post, saying that she had to keep up appearances to keep them safe. As long as she promised to keep in contact, they knew they would see her again. Holding Rowan close, she kissed his forehead. Walking over to their new home, she placed her son into his crib when Anakin's ship arrived. Hurrying over, she saw Anakin exit his ship with a young woman beside him. She couldn't be older than 16. Anakin had his cloak around the girl's shoulders. Saria. Tyro shouted, running over to them. The young woman dropped down to her knees, embracing her brother with tears in her eyes. Padme walked over, helping her stand up. Come on, let's get you inside to get you changed, Padme told her. The girl's eyes widened when she saw Padme. That's Senator Amidala. She gasped. Padme watched as the girl bowed down. My lady, she murmured. Please don't, Padme answered, getting the girl to stand up. I haven't been a senator for a long time. The girl's hands were shaking. I'm Saria Twin, my cousin, Sabe, was your decoy as queen, Saria told her. Padme's eyes widened at the name. Let's get you inside and change before we talk, she told them. She looked at her husband before she led them to their home. Saria had changed into more comfortable clothing, and the two twin children were sitting at the table, eating the stew she placed in front of them. Sabe, how is she? She asked. She's in hiding, as are the rest of us, Saria told her. She's a slave? Padme asked with wide eyes. Saria nodded her head slowly. A lot of slave smugglers came to Naboo a couple of months ago. They were saying they were part of a rebellion, and they would take us to safety from the Empire, she explained. Padme sat back with a shaky breath, and Anakin stood behind his wife, his hands on her shoulders. But my lady, I was able to find where Sabe was sent. She's safe, I assure you, Saria told her. How do you know? Anakin asked. I know my cousin's personal life fairly well, sir. Arai Picus purchased her. My lady, that is her husband's alias that he made up just in case something like this happened, Saria explained. Padme couldn't help but feel very relieved. How did you two get separated from your family? Anakin asked. My family fell for the trick, they put us on the ship before we could even say anything. Aunt Sabe had gone on the ship to rescue us, Saria explained. Anakin stood beside the young woman. You are safe now, he assured her. Saria nodded and continued to eat her stew. Walking outside, Anakin found Bastila playing with her daughter. Sasha was beaming as her mother had a crystal float back and forth between her hands. The sunlight was bouncing off the crystal, having colors dance on her daughter's hands. Pretty mama, she said beaming. They are beautiful, aren't they, sweetheart? She cooed softly. Anakin walked over to Bastila. I want to thank you, he told her. Bastila stood up, looking at her former apprentice. You are a passionate person, Anakin. You just have to keep in mind though of what is right and wrong, she told him. Nodding his head slowly, he let out a sigh. Being a father has calmed you, as well as finding your sister, she commented. My family is full again, he answered. Chuckling lightly, she touched his arm. You remind me so much of the son I had lost, she said softly. She touched his cheek gently with a sad smile. You look like the Anakin I had known, but the personality of the son I had, she added. Brave men, I'm sure, he answered. Extremely, I miss them, but I'm happy now as well, she said smiling. Smiling, she lifted Sasha up into her arms. What happened to your son? He asked. Sasha slowly looked over her shoulder, her eyes showing pure sadness. Maddie, he was only 22 when I lost him. He was a brand new father, his son was only a couple of months old when we lost him, she explained. She kissed the top of her Sasha's head. Anakin, I think the rest of the story should be for another time, she told him. Of course, he answered. Smiling softly, she touched his arm before she went over to her home with her daughter in her arms. Anakin couldn't help but wonder what happened to her son, he couldn't help but wonder. He knew that he would just have to wait a little while longer to find out. Walking into her home, Bastila sat down beside her husband while Sasha ran off to play. You alright? Obi-Wan asked, wrapping his arms around her. I will be, she replied. She rested her head on his chest, closing her eyes. I love you, she said softly. Obi-Wan kissed the top of her head. "And I love you," he answered. Back in the Skywalker home, Anakin stood behind his wife with his arms around her waist. Padme smiled as she leaned back against his chest. "I love you," he whispered lovingly into her ear. "And I love you," she answered softly. Closing her eyes, she relaxed in his arms as they imagined what their lives would be like on Ossus. The Skywalker house was calm, the children were fast asleep in their beds. Anakin and Padme were in their room wrapped up in each other's arms. Except, sweat was beginning to form on Anakin's brow as he began to struggle with a dream he was having. Anakin seemed to be standing on the side, like an audience watching a show. He saw that he was in some sort of city that he didn't recognize. He saw a platform and he saw a young man making his way around a corner. He recognized the young man immediately, how could he not, it was his son. He watched as the figure he had seen in many of his dreams take Luke by surprise, attacking him. He watched his son fight valiantly against his opponent, only to be defeated when the Sith severed his hand. "There is no escape, don't make me destroy you," the Sith told him. He watched as his son tried to move away from the monster before him. "Luke, you do not yet realize your importance. You have only begun to discover your power. Join me and I will complete your training. Our combined strength we can end this destructive conflict and bring order to the galaxy," the Sith told him. "I'll never join you," he heard his son call out. "If only knew the power of the dark side." "Obi-Wan never told you what happened to your father," he commented. "He told me enough." "He told me you killed him," Luke answered. "No, I am your father," the Sith told him. Anakin woke up breathing heavily from the nightmare he had. Pressing his hand against his forehead, he slowly detangled himself from Padme's arms, so not to wake her. Swallowing hard, he got up from bed and grabbed his robe off the chair, pulling it on as he left. Walking into the twins' room, he stood beside Luke's bed touching his hair softly. His gentle caresses stirred the boy as he turned over and opened his sky-blue eyes. "Sorry, Luke, I didn't mean to wake you up," he said quietly. "It's okay," Luke replied tiredly. Luke reached up, resting his hand on his father's wrist. "I love you, Luke, very, very much," he said quietly. "I love you, Daddy," the boy replied before drifting off to sleep. Standing up, Anakin left the room. Walking outside, Anakin closed his eyes as he tried to meditate of what he had witnessed in his dream. "I sense a lot of conflict in you, my one-time apprentice," Bastila commented as she walked up. Opening his eyes, he looked over at Bastila as she walked over to him. "I have never felt so much conflict come from you before," she added. Frowning, his eyes found the ground more interesting. "I saw myself in a dream, Bastila, I saw myself as that dark figure again. That monster, I saw myself attacking my own son," he murmured. Bastila stood in front of him, resting her hand on his arm. "Why are you rethinking over all the work you have done?" she asked. "I feel like it's not enough," he replied. "Women and children are still being taken away and treated like animals. Are you angry and hateful toward that, or the fact that your family has gone through so much during slavery that you are using your own personal hate toward all of them?" she asked as she sat down on a rock. Anakin shook his head slowly with a slight shrug. I'm not sure," he replied truthfully. Bastila sighed softly. "Anakin, keep your mind open. I keep telling you that," she said softly. Anakin closed his eyes, letting out a deep breath. "Anakin, remember you have something to fight for," she reminded him. "I know," he murmured. Bastila looked over to see Padme walking out. Getting up, she left them alone going back to her own home while Padme sat beside her husband. "Ani, are you alright?" she asked, holding his hand in hers. Anakin let out a sigh. "I just feel like all the work I've done has been for nothing," he answered. Padme rested her forehead against the side of his head. "Ani, you're not going to solve slavery overnight," she reminded him softly. Closing his eyes, Anakin wrapped his arms around his wife and held her tight. "I love you," he whispered. "I love you too," she replied, rubbing his arm. Back in the Kenobi home, Bastila was walking down the stairs when she felt the sharp pain go through her body again. Gasping softly, she gripped the rail and slowly slid to the floor while holding her throbbing side. Closing her eyes tight, she clenched her hand into a fist. "Bastila," she heard her husband call quietly. Obi-Wan walked around the corner to find his wife on the floor holding her side in pain. "It's happening again," she replied, gritting her teeth. Obi-Wan pulled his wife into his arms as she tried to fight the pain. "Just relax," he told her as he pressed his hands against the affected areas. While Obi-Wan healed his wife, they didn't notice that Sasha had got out of bed. "What's wrong with Mama?" Sasha asked with wide eyes. "Mama's not feeling well," Obi-Wan replied. Bastila felt extremely weak once Obi-Wan finished healing the pain shooting through her body. "Mama Ade?" Sasha asked. "She'll be alright," he replied, stroking his wife's hair as her eyes began to close. Lifting Bastila up into his arms, he carried her to their room before he got his daughter into her own bed. Just as Obi-Wan went to go back to bed, he heard a knock on the door. Who could that be? He muttered as he walked over to answer the door. The person standing there made his eyes narrow. I thought my wife and I sent you off. He asked, and how did you find us? Just because Bastila doesn't use the bond we have anymore doesn't mean I am incapable of finding her, Revan replied. Obi-Wan cursed in his head that he had left his lightsaber in his room. What do you want? He demanded. I came to see if you are taking care of her, Revan replied, walking right by the former Jedi general. In case you haven't noticed, Revan, Bastila is my wife, not yours. You might share a bond with her, but it is quite obvious she has no desire to continue with it, Obi-Wan told him. She hasn't continued with the bond since she started having relations with my brother, Revan answered as he stared at the jalapik sitting on the table. Obi-Wan narrowed his eyes at him. You make it sound like she is some sort of harlot, he said irritably. Kenobi, think about it. The woman has had 3 children, none have the same father, Revan answered. Her first 2 children didn't have fathers because one was a selfish idiot and the other was killed defending her, Obi-Wan said with a glare. Revan shook his head slowly. Why are you here, Revan? It is the middle of the night and I would like to go to bed, he added. Well, you need help, Revan answered as he continued to stare at the jalapiks. Obi-Wan was silent. You'll need someone with more than your fight experience to defeat the Sith Lord, he added. We are fine, Obi-Wan answered. Really? No rebellion is being formed and Sidious's rule gets stronger by the day, Revan told him. Revan removed his hood so to really look at the former Jedi's face. You see, Obi-Wan, there is a bigger problem than us fighting over a woman, he commented. Who's fighting over a woman? Can't fight for someone who has already chosen, Obi-Wan replied. Nevertheless, this is bigger than the 2 of us. A war will be upon us again, and Bastila's former apprentice will be the leader of it all, Revan told him. We all know what Anakin is capable of, Obi-Wan replied. Revan held up his hand. Aha, but did you read the whole prophecy, you Jedi? He asked. What are you talking about? Obi-Wan asked. Our chosen one has a chosen destiny. That destiny is he will sacrifice his life to save the galaxy, Revan answered. Obi-Wan stared at him in shock. We must help Anakin prepare for that part of the prophecy, he added. He's not going to know, Bastila answered from the doorway. They both looked over at her. Bastila, you aren't seriously considering hiding the boy's inevitable death from him, are you? Revan asked. Yes, because if we tell him, it'll only upset him and his family, Bastila replied. His family should be prepared, Revan told him. Bastila glared. How can you be so heartless about this? She demanded. They should know that he is to die when he destroys the Sith and puts the Force back in the balance, Revan answered. He has a wife and 3 young children in there. Young children who see their father as invincible and cannot die, she told him. Death comes to everyone, even you, Bastila, should know that no one is invincible. You never taught your son that though, he answered. Bastila's answer was a punch to his jaw. I told you that you are to never speak of my son. You have no right to ever talk about him, she hissed. Revan just wiped the blood from his lip. My son was 22, too young to even fathom the idea of death coming to him. Anakin will not die, she added. You cannot prevent death, he answered. Oh, but I have, she told him. Bastila couldn't help but smile. The moment I took Anakin as my apprentice, I changed his destiny. He is still the chosen one, but he will not die when he puts the Force back in the balance. That is not Anakin's fate anymore. Oh, death will come to him, Revan, but he won't be a man of 42 who dies in his son's arms, she explained. How can you possibly know that? He demanded. But being on a ship alone for thousands of years, Revan, I meditated with the Force and opened my mind to look further into one's future, she replied. Revan stared for a minute. I think we need to work together, nevertheless, the boy's future, he answered. Before Obi-Wan could object, Bastila took a step forward. On one condition, you leave us and Anakin's family alone, she answered. Revan was silent for a minute before nodding his head slowly. Agreed, he murmured before walking away. Obi-Wan watched him leave before looking at his wife. Are you sure about Anakin's future? He asked. Yes, she replied, smiling. Obi-Wan held his wife's hand as they went back to their room. You look like you have a question on your mind, she murmured, kissing his shoulder. Sighing, he lied down in their bed, pulling his wife with him. Holding her hand in his, he moved his thumb over her knuckles. Just out of curiosity, have you looked into our future? He asked. Smiling, she sat up on her arm, looking down at him. Why are you wondering what I saw? She asked. A bit, my future scene for us isn't as detailed as yours might be, he replied, laughing a little bit. All you need to know is that you're stuck with me for life, she told him. Now that's something to look forward to, he answered. She started laughing some more when he pushed her down and moved on top of her. Back at the Skywalker home, Padme was holding her husband and as they were lying awake in bed. She was moving her fingers up and down his chest and abs, knowing he was still awake. Talk to me, Ani, she said softly. Sighing, Anakin moved his hand up and down her bare back. I'm thinking of home, he murmured. Tatooine? She asked. No, he replied. He moved so he was on top of her, moving his fingers through her hair. Naboo, he replied. Padme sighed as she ran her hands up and down his arms. I miss Naboo too, my parents, my sister, my nieces, she murmured. He stroked her cheek softly, resting his forehead against hers. They haven't seen our children, Anakin. For all they know we're dead, she added quietly. They would know if they were, but it is a shame about our children not knowing them, he answered. Adam reached up, tracing the scar over his eye before touching the scars on his jawline. Do you regret being married to me? He asked. She looked up at him. Why would you ask that? She asked. I feel like because of me you can't see them, he replied. Adam shook her head slowly. If anything I should be asking you that, Sidious wants me dead, she said quietly. He doesn't exactly want me alive either, he pointed out. Sighing, she continued to trace his scars. Anakin, I love you. Not even Sidious can keep me away from you, she answered. Smiling, he pressed his lips to hers. Same here Angel, he said quietly. Leaning forward, he pressed his lips to hers again. I love you, he whispered. I love you too, she replied, hugging him tight.